Okay, class, so I hope you found that office video. I think that's a really great example of conditioning. Obviously, in that case, it was very intentional, and Jim was trying to condition Dwight. But often in our daily lives, we become conditioned to things without even realizing it. And so let's kind of deconstruct this example. So, step one before the conditioning, the Altoid causes Dwight to stick his hand out. So the Altoid is the unconditioned stimulus, and sticking his hand out is the unconditioned response. And so this is just his natural response to being offered an Altoid. And then the computer noise does not cause the hand to come out. And so the computer noise is the conditioned stimulus. In this case, it's neutral. It's a neutral stimulus, and it does not prompt this response. And so the handout is still this unconditioned response. But during the conditioning, Jim pairs the computer noise with the Altoid. And so when he hears the computer noise, he offers Dwight an Altoid. And he does that over and over and over again so that this neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. And then that causes Dwight to stick his hand out. But it's still the unconditioned response because learning hasn't happened yet. But after repeated pairings with the computer noise, it causes Dwight to stick his hand out. And so at this point, the Altoid isn't even involved in the scenario. It's been removed from the scenario, but he still sticks his hand out. And so now we know that learning has happened, and Dwight sticking his hand out has become a conditioned response. Okay. So notice how classical conditioning is an example of associative learning. So our minds naturally connect events that occur in close sequence. This occurs automatically without our intention. And so we really learn these associations and we behave in response to them automatically. And there's a lot of examples. So if you can imagine, if you eat a donut before getting on a boat and then you get really sick on the boat, you might start to associate donuts with being sick. And so you can't eat donuts in the future. That's one example. Here's a funny little cartoon that I found. Okay, so now I want to give you guys one more example just because I think that there can never be enough examples with classical conditioning. Okay, so this is Bob. Bob is taking a shower. Early one morning, Bob is taking a shower. While he's showering, his wife enters and flushes the toilet. The shower pours out scalding hot water, making Bob yelp in pain. The same thing happens the next 3 days. So his wife comes in, uses the toilet, flushes the toilet, and then the water gets really hot and Bob yelps in pain. After a while, Bob is again showering. And once again, his wife enters to use the toilet. At the sound of the toilet flushing, Bob panics and jumps out of the shower, even before it gets hot. Later that day, as he passes by the bathroom of his house, he hears his wife flushing the toilet. Bob automatically tenses up. This is an example of learning because an experience, feeling the hot water, has changed Bob's reaction to the toilet flushing. And remember, learning is an enduring change in the learner in response to experience. And so he has this experience and it changes his response to the sound of a toilet flushing. And so in this example, we have the hot water, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and it causes a scream and pain, which is the unconditioned response. And so again, these are unconditioned because it doesn't require any learning. They happen naturally. But then we have a conditioned stimulus, which is neutral. It doesn't produce the unconditioned response. But if it's repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and it produces this unconditioned response. And this is during the training period where these things are repeatedly associated together. Eventually, the sound of the toilet produces this scream and fear of pain. And this is a conditioned stimulus producing a conditioned response. And so again, at this point, learning has happened and the response is now conditioned. So a couple things to think about. Conditioning occurs without effort. We don't try to be conditioned. It just happens automatically. So you make these associations between stimuli without trying to. Another thing to keep in mind is that the training period varies for how long it takes to learn a conditioned response. And so for really strong unconditioned, or let's see, so if you a really strong conditioned, like a conditioning period, so if you associate like a shock with the ringing of a bell, that shock is really strong, and the association between shock and pain is really strong. And so if you ring a bell along with a shock, it's not going to take that long for you to associate the bell with pain because the shock is so strong. And so there are varying amounts of time it takes to learn things, but so it depends on like the strength of your reaction to something. And then extinction occurs when your conditioned response becomes weakened when the unconditioned stimulus is absent. So in the example with Bob, if he's taking a shower and he tells his wife not to use the toilet, and so she doesn't flush the toilet while he's in the shower. And when he's not in the shower and he hears the toilet flushing, he might initially kind of tense up. But after a while, if he hears the toilet flushing and nothing happens, eventually he'll relearn that this is not a dangerous stimulus, and it'll lead to less panicking or even no panicking at all. And so you can extinguish a conditioned response over time by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So initially, acquisition is the term of learning that association, and so the association gets stronger and stronger over time. But then extinction occurs when you present the conditioned stimulus alone over time, and then your response gets weaker and weaker. However, there's also something called a spontaneous recovery. And so sometimes, even after extinction occurs, after a period of time, your conditioned response might spontaneously come back. So spontaneously, Bob might tense up in response to a toilet flushing, even after a long period of time has passed where he hasn't tensed up in response to the toilet flushing. And so it just shows that, these learned responses, even when they disappear, they might not be completely gone because they can sort of spontaneously come back at random. And so that's one kind of interesting thing about classical conditioning, is that, extinction may never completely eliminate the response. It might only just suppress it. So here's an example of the spontaneous recovery, where even after the response has been extinguished, hearing the toilet flush will make him panic again. And usually the response is weaker than it was after it was first learned. Okay, so can you think of examples of conditioning in your own life? So just think about this for a second. Think about responses that you have to stimuli that aren't their natural, isn't the natural response. So like, startling in response to a loud noise is a natural response. But if you startle when someone opens the door, or when you see like a certain image or a certain stimulus, that might be a conditioned response. Or if you feel nauseous at the sight of certain foods because you once got sick with it, that's an example of a conditioned response. I already mentioned the fast food example, and so you might see this logo of Whataburger and it might make you salivate or start to feel hungry for maybe your favorite food there. That's an example of a conditioned response because this image is just an abstract image, and without that learned response, it wouldn't produce any response at all. At the sound of a bell, you might think that you might get this feeling that you're late for something because, after years in school, hearing the bell is a sign that it's like time to be in class. And so that sound might trigger like feelings of being late in you. I already mentioned the sound of, sirens. Like this is something that might trigger feelings of fear or just like worrying about some danger or an emergency. These are just examples. I'm sure you guys can think of others. Okay, so what are some applications of classical conditioning in the real world? So one of the biggest ones is phobias. So there's this famous case study with phobia involving this little baby named Albert. And so phobias are a type of fear, just if you didn't know that. I think you learned that in your psychological disorders. But some people, so behavioral psychologists, behaviorists, think that phobias come from association and classical conditioning learning. And so in this one case study with a baby called Little Albert, he was the son of someone that John Watson knew. So John Watson is a behaviorist. And John Watson didn't really believe the prevailing theories about fear and phobias, and he thought that you could condition a phobia. And so he went and tried to do that with little baby Albert. So first what he did was he showed little Albert a white rat, and then little Albert showed a normal, healthy response to the rat. He was, happy, and he was interested in the rat. He showed no fear. This baby was kind of fearless. He was curious about the rat. He just showed kind of a natural, happy response. But then John Watson started to, then he clanged a steel bar with a hammer. And then, of course, this produced a natural reflex in little baby Albert. He started to cry and get really scared because of this loud noise. So this is the unconditioned stimulus with the unconditioned response. And then during training, John Watson presented the white rat with the clanging of the hammer over and over again, and upset little baby Albert, until eventually, when little baby Albert saw the rat on its own, he had this conditioned response. And so he learned to fear the rat. And so John Watson assumed that he developed this phobia of rats because he was conditioned. So behaviorists view phobias as exaggerated responses acquired through learning. And so again, so how would this be cured? And so, if following the principles of classical conditioning, if we repeatedly pair the conditioned stimulus with nothing or with something pleasant, that could cure the phobia. And so this is the conditioned response. And if we start to present the rat with something pleasant, like a bottle or a rattle, then eventually little Albert will learn that this is not something to fear, and eventually it will extinguish that response. And this is, according to the behaviorists, this is just one view of phobias, and it's probably not the case that most phobias are caused by conditioning, but if they were caused by conditioning, you could cure it by practicing extinction like this. Generalization is the process of generalizing a stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, to other things. And so instead of just fearing a white rat, little baby Albert feared all fuzzy white things, including Santa's beard. And so this is called generalization, is where during the learning process, we don't just learn the response to that very specific conditioned stimulus. We generalize to other things that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then you can open the next recording. Oops. Shoot. Hold on, sorry, I'm trying to close this out. There we go.